Hello, good evening, everybody. We are live on Instagram, on Facebook, on X, on YouTube. This is so exciting. I've got the coolest guest today, an FDA whistleblower. He is making his rounds right now, sounding the alarm about the chemicals in our food. And he's here today with us, which I'm so excited about. I first learned about Darin Detwiler from this article in the Daily Mail where the title was Ex-FDA Food Expert Reveals Why Kellogg's Fruit Loops is the worst cereal in the U.S. amid calls for a cancer chemical ban. This title got my attention. Wow. So he is here with us today. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes here, waiting for people to join. Today was 55 days that Kellogg's had not posted a social media response until this afternoon, and they started to go on social media this afternoon. It's absolutely been incredible. It's been 55 days. It's been since the testimony that I gave at the Senate roundtable where we talked about this problem that American companies are poisoning us with ingredients they don't use in other countries. And 55 days, we made it a long time. And now they've decided to start posting again. So I don't know if you guys are willing or excited about them posting again. Maybe you can tell them to stop poisoning American children with ingredients they don't use in countries like Canada and Australia, in India, and all of Europe. Or you can tell them, hey, how come you didn't let us in when we went to your headquarters in Battle Creek, Michigan with 400,000 signatures? Why do you continue to ignore us and poison our kids? I would love to see if we can just maybe shut them down for another 55 days, because it is absolutely insane that they haven't made the commitment yet to remove artificial food dyes like they said they were going to do in 2015. So without further ado, I think we have critical mass here. I'm going to introduce Dr. Darin Detwiler. Here we go. I'm going to take this off. Hi, Darin, Dr. Darin. Let me see. Let me get you off of mute here. Hi, how are you doing?
Good. Yourself?
I'm doing great. So you've been busy lately, I hear.
I am a busy person, whether I'm abroad speaking with the global food supply stakeholders or other places in the U.S., or even when I'm here at home in my home office. There seems to be no shortage of issues, concerns, outbreaks, and recalls. And I think what's kind of crazy is I actually prepared, I did a lecture at Michigan State University today via Zoom, but I had prepared some material for it 2 or 3 weeks ago. Since I prepared that lecture, my comments and my slides, now we have the concern with the outbreak and the deadly outbreak and recall with carrots. Obviously, we have the issue going on with onions in the quarter pounders at McDonald's, and there just seems to be no shortage of situations in which consumers are asking a lot of questions. The media is asking a lot of questions in terms of why are these happening? Why are these things going on? Who regulates this? And what is going on with our food?
Right. And you've been doing this for 25 years.
31.
31. Oh, even longer. Okay. So I'm looking at an old bio here. So 31 years, you've worked for the FDA, you've worked for the USDA.
So clarifying that, I was appointed, I served as a special advisor with the USDA. I served 2 terms advising the Secretary of Agriculture. Prior to that, I was an unofficial advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture in the early 90s. And with the FDA, I have been on an advisory council, but not actually. I think that the media sometimes changes words to be convenient. I have never been an employee of the FDA, but I have worked with the FDA over the last 12, 15 years in terms of the Food Safety Modernization Act, the rules, the implementation, and dealing with a variety of other issues, in addition to working in terms of outbreak and other issues related to food safety.
Now, while you were working with the FDA and the USDA in this advisory capacity, did you ever see any conflicts of interest?
Well, the USDA has been long criticized and even lost in court once many years ago in terms of having folks. When you look at like the My Healthy Plate or the USDA's food pyramid, there were advisory folks working on that were basically representing whether it was like the dairy industry, the cheese council, the whatever council it was, and some of their background information was not. Let's just say they could have been more transparent in terms of the backgrounds and the corporates that these folks represented, and that would have allowed for perhaps a little bit of oversight that could have prevented some of the conflict of interest. When I served on these panels, I was the only person that was a quote unquote consumer representative. The rest of the people were always people who own this company, who, a lawyer for this company, things of that nature. And you saw a lot of that work being to the industry's benefit. There are still some things that I do not agree with today, namely the idea of when, the American public hears about recalls. I'm always asked the same questions. Well, like these things are inspected, right? A lot of people don't understand who inspects what and to what degree things are inspected. But even worse, most people think that if something's inspected or a test is taken, that these companies, they wait for the test results to come back before they ship things out into commerce. No, the food industry worked really hard to make sure the federal government could not require companies to hold on to their product until test results come back. This is why we have recalls, because it's already shipped out onto, to retail. It's on the shelves when these recalls are made. Even this most recent, very recent, the carrot issue. Look at how much recall, so many different types of packages from so many different retailers. The costs of recall, and I'm not even talking about human toll and harm to people, but the cost of recalls are ridiculously expensive. And I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that the industry had a significant voice in terms of making sure that, they didn't have to hold on to these products. And I think that the reason is because they know that when they call a recall, most of this food's already consumed.
Yeah. And you're really passionate about food safety. And I would love for you to share that with the audience of why.
So there's a documentary called Poisoned on Netflix. It just won an Emmy. And in that, I go into great detail about the 1993 Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak. And Jack in the Box is mostly on the West Coast. It's a fast food hamburger chain. Very much like if you're in California on the West Coast, it's very much like, a Burger King, McDonald's, but it's not as nationwide and international as those other brands. 1993, there was an E. coli outbreak, and E. coli was something that most people never heard of. I had not heard of it. And, at the time it was one of those, oh, well, you just don't eat that food. We won't go to, at the time we were living near Seattle, don't go to Seattle and eat at a fast food restaurant and don't have hamburgers. Eventually you found out that it was Jack in the Box. Okay, so just avoid Jack in the Box. The problem is that one of the big lessons we learned out of that was that people were getting sick, not from eating the product, but also, not just from eating the product, but also from person-to-person contact. People who got sick with E. coli, and the same thing happens with like salmonella and other pathogens. People who get sick with foodborne pathogens, it's in their system, and if they're not washing their hands properly, it basically can be spread to another person. In this case, I had a 16-month-old son at the time, and he was in a daycare class. And there was another kid in his daycare class who tested positive for E. coli. Both his parents worked at the only Jack in the Box in town. And they got their child tested because they thought he was sick, but it took 48 hours for their test results to come back. During that time, when the test results came back, they found out that the parents put the child back in daycare so they could go back. And the mom was sick from E. coli. They could go back to working at the restaurant while sick with E. coli. Find out that my kid had, my 16-month-old son, Riley, showed symptoms. And between the time where he showed his first symptoms and 30 days later, my child at 16 months of age died from an E. coli infection. There was a lot of misinformation put out there by the industry, that was put out there by other stakeholders. And I was watching it unroll in front of me. The doctors were saying things that contradicted what the food company was saying. And at the time, I ended up speaking to President Bill Clinton on live television, and we talked on the Phil Donahue show and some other television shows. And when my son died, President Clinton called me, and he wanted to talk father to father. And it was kind of what do we do? Where do we go from here? Realizing that most of his illness had played out on television at the time. Everything from him being airlifted. I didn't go on top of the building and see my son being airlifted in a helicopter to Children's Hospital in Seattle. I watched it on the television news. I watched a lot of television news coverage, and I participated in a lot of news at the time, telling the conflict between what the company was saying and what the doctors were saying, what the health department was saying. And so, here I am in between the date of my son's death and when we buried him, and talking to the president. And he goes, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, look, I lost my son, but I don't want to live in a universe where my son lost his father." And as a result of that, I've spent the last 31 some odd years working as someone who has been a voice, an advocate, and then some for food safety and how we rethink our relationship with food and how we communicate about food and how we look at awareness and advocacy when it comes to food. And at this point in my career, I'm a professor, and I'm an author, and it's one of those things where there's no shortage of the work that I am doing. And that's I think that's you and I had talked before about the fact that there's only so many people that are on the stage or at certain events or at the table, if you will, representing the consumer's interest, whereas there's always enough seats that are filled by corporate entities and sponsors and those who have a definite if you will, conflict of interest in terms of talking about these issues. When I am on that stage or when I'm at that table participating and representing the consumer's perspective, I realize that I am representing so many families that, like myself, they live with a chair forever empty at their family table because of something that could have been prevented or at least done differently in the food industry.
Well, I just want to say I'm so deeply sorry for your loss, and I know I've told you that in previous conversations, but hearing your story, I think is something that I wanted everyone to hear, because I think when we look at what's happening in this country with our children and chronic disease rates, and how, the USDA just published that 38% of preteens, between 12 and 18 years old is going to have pre-diabetes. I think about the next generation. I think about our health. I think about how we're the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to any industrialized nation, when it comes to health, but we spend the most money on healthcare. I think about these food safety issues that you're so passionate about, and it affecting little children like your son. And it's this work, hearing your story, hearing other stories about health is what drives me to keep going, because I think about me when I was little and how sick I was. And I think about all the people in my life that have died because of health related issues, because of diet or because of toxins in their environment. And it's just deeply meaningful work when there's someone like you that has experienced what you have, been able to come to the table and tell us the truth about what's going on and actually represent consumers. And I love that about you. When you think about ingredients that are approved for use in the United States, how do you feel about American companies using more toxic versions of their ingredients here in United States products? American companies, iconic American companies. I mean, not just Kellogg's. I mean, a lot of people are familiar with the Kellogg's fight, but in my Senate testimony, I talked about McDonald's. I talked about PepsiCo. I talked about Mars. I talked about General Mills. You know, in Australia, they just released a Trix without artificial food dyes. They actually advertise it on the front of the box. And you know, they also have a cinnamon toast crunch over there without BHT, which is an endocrine disrupting chemical. How do you feel about these American iconic companies selling us the more toxic version of their products?
So I have kind of two sets of answers for this. On the political and regulatory side, so we have a thing in the United States called generally regarded as safe, or GRAS. And essentially, it is a list of ingredients. Now, the average consumer thinks like water, rice, beans, corn, salt, right? But the reality is that most of the things that are generally regarded as safe are chemicals we can't even, the average person couldn't even pronounce, kind of a thing. And what gets me about it is not only is this a system in the United States that we don't see in Europe, for instance. There's no such thing. There's way more transparency and expectation of independent testing and validation and verification of these ingredients. Whereas in the United States, we just kind of take the industry's word for granted in terms of, oh, they're safe. We have our own tests. That, it is to some degree considered to be something that the FDA oversees. But in reality, if the FDA were to go and say, hey, we want to see how you validated that, industry has the right to say, oh, it's corporate private information. We can't allow you to see that. So it's like a loophole within a loophole. So basically, not only does industry get to determine what is generally regarded as safe and how they will determine that it is generally regarded as safe, but if questioned about it, they don't have to show what it is because it's like, secret ingredients and their proprietary information. So I'm not comfortable with that scenario here. The second side of that, though, is I recently attended an event where there were some experts within food processing and within food coloring and additives and things of that nature. And believe me, when the microphone came my way to ask questions, I took advantage of that. What gets me is when you have someone who says things like, well, look, yeah, there are other places in the world where they use natural colorings, but the color's just not as exciting and fun there. It's a different color of yellow or a different color of blue. And those people over in Europe, they just don't know any better in terms of how fun these colors could be. And, it's always been like this. It will take a lot of work for us to convince the American consumer that they should have a lesser of a color or a lesser of an experience from this. And yeah. So when I ask, well, why do we use the chemicals here? But the same exact companies use the natural ingredients for food coloring in other countries. And I got answers like, well, it's cheaper, it's easier to control. We can have protected information around that chemical. Information, ingredient stuff, and it's more dependable and we don't have to worry about it. So basically what you're telling me is it's easier and cheaper for you to put consumers more at risk using artificial colorants as opposed to natural food colorings. And when the person starts shaking their head, you got to, that whole idea of, it's almost like they said the silent part out loud. That's kind of my big takeaway from it. I think it's amazing when we look at how the last 3 decades, what I've noticed about consumers is 3 decades ago, consumers were rarely listened to. Today, consumers are far more considered to be stakeholders in the bigger picture of the food industry. We are, as consumers, we spend, and let me rephrase that. As consumers, we essentially vote with our food money. If we don't like an ingredient, we'll go to another brand. If we don't like a brand because of their ethics or their discrimination practices or their child labor violations, whatever it is, even if it has nothing to do with food safety and quality, we will go to another brand or another retailer or another restaurant. And, since 2015, the US Census Bureau shows that Americans spend more money, more of their food money on food that's prepared out of the house than they do on raw ingredients that they take home and prepare for meals themselves.
Mhm.
So we have to look at that balance that we have there and the opportunity to not only build awareness, but really think of consumers as allies in terms of, look, the industry is going to just continue to use artificial flavorings and colorings and ingredients unless we essentially say, no, we're not going to buy your product anymore until you make these changes. I know you can have 400 and some odd thousand signatures. That would be seen by industry as an interesting observation. What they care about is when you look at quarterly profit earnings and stakeholder dividends and things of that nature, when the stock value decreases, when the profits decrease, when the quarterly profit earning statements decrease, that is when they start to listen to things. And in the United States, if we were to look at the biggest failures, there was the Chipotle outbreaks. That was a $25 million federal fine, which to me and you may seem $25 million. That's a lot of money. That was barely half of 1% of their profit for that year.
Yeah.
So these largest of government fines are next to nothing. It's like literally, it's the cost of doing business. However, we as consumers can create far more of an economic pressure on them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a message that you continue to share with your audience.
Yeah. And that's, this is, the cancel Kellogg's movement, to boycott Kellogg's started when they didn't let us in the door at Battle Creek. They didn't have the decency to sit down and meet with us. Every other, petition I've done, anytime I've reached out to a major food corporation, they have at least the dignity to send me a letter back. Kellogg's did not. And so, they could have really disarmed us that day by just letting us in the door, receiving the petitions, telling us we're listening, even if they agreed to disagree, whatever, it would have disarmed us a little bit. But instead, they energized the movement. And now people are canceling Kellogg's like nobody's business. And we have, all kinds of celebrities and other people joining our movement, which is so exciting.
Well,
but I think, go ahead.
I was going to say another dimension of that is what you saw on TikTok in terms of the cancel boycott, or I'm sorry, the boycott Kellogg's, is that after so Kellogg split into Kellanova, which is kind of like everything except their cereal,
right?
In a very simplified way of looking at it. But then they had this new CEO of just the cereal brands. And when he came out and answered questions about the cost of food and things of that nature, and basically made the statement that, if other food is too expensive, then maybe, consumers should just eat breakfast cereal for dinner. That really angered a lot of consumers, this whole idea of, it's too bad, even though we're showing record profits, our cereal prices are too high. Maybe you should just be eating cereal for breakfast. A lot that, again, magnifying the impact of how they're being perceived by consumers as stakeholders really added to, I believe, this whole, boycott of the Kellogg's products. And, seeing this through a social media lens, I mean, this was incredible. You realize that, I mentioned how consumers have changed and they're seen more as stakeholders in the game. I really think that social media has played a role in that.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, social media was more of, that's where you got information and that's where you kind of talked about things. We've gone from passive to active, even to generative. The idea of people putting information out there. We saw this, for instance, with the pink sauce issue and the Daily Harvest issue, where people initially were social media influencers saying, oh, you should buy this, until they bought it and got sick or found out how bad it was. And then it's like, now we turn the page. You shouldn't get this because of this. You shouldn't do this because of this. Let me tell you why. add to that fact that there are websites like iwaspoisoned.com where there's crowdsourcing of information. There are entire outbreaks and illnesses that are not reported to health department, but they find out through social media when enough people post enough information that can actually point investigators to where there are situations. One of those many outbreaks remember all those Chipotle outbreaks?
Yeah.
One of those outbreaks was only found because of crowdsourcing of information on a web page, on the iwaspoisoned.com webpage. There's documented evidence that showed that well before we ever heard about this whole thing with the E. coli and onions on the McDonald's Quarter Pounders, there was crowdsourcing of information 6 or 7 weeks earlier in which
Mhm.
people were sharing this information. So we have to look at our relationship with food as changing. We have to look at it not only in terms of how we eat food, but how we communicate our preferences, our expectations, even that level of accountability that we want to see in terms of what the food industry is doing. And no more should we kind of allow the industry to be this kind of well, if one customer doesn't like this, there'll be another one along in any minute now, like we're
Mhm.
trains or something like that. Because the reality is, anytime there's been significant federal policy change, when it comes to food, whether it is a pathogen or an additive or anything along that lines, it is always after there are significant numbers of consumers who have been harmed. So in a way, consumers are basically seen as canaries in the coal mine. If we harm enough people, maybe then we'll make a change. Heaven forbid a company be proactive and say our legacy is more important than being accidental leaders. We need to
Yeah.
be intenseful. I'm sorry. We need to be intentional, and we need to be proactive. And quite honestly, we need to be Herculean in our efforts in terms of saying this is what we have to do to live up to our brand, to live up to the consumer expectation, to make sure that our consumers are safe. And I believe that recently you talked about how even people who are very well connected to industry, these very companies are not necessarily living up to the same mission they used to live up to.
Yeah, 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 they're not. And that was present in my interview with Victoria Kellogg, who was the Harris of WK Kellogg, her great 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 grandfather who started Kellogg's, and she was dismayed at this issue, and she is asking Kellogg's to apologize and take back their false vow, and she's demanding that they remove the artificial food dyes and BHT as well. And I mean, that is absolutely courageous of her. I call it courage over corruption. It's absolutely amazing what she did to come forward like that. I have to ask you a question. In Kellogg's recent statement, they've kind of doubled down on their statements that they're giving to the media now that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and others are starting to report on them, as well as just about every single news network now. Even CNN did a piece a couple days ago. They say the colors we use in our cereals have been deemed safe by scientific bodies around the world at the totality of research. Do you think that's a lie?
Um, I would ask those same companies to show that research, and I guarantee the majority of those companies would say we can't show it to you because it's corporate private information.
Oh,
We
great.
don't, we don't
I
want this
don't know.
information
And
to
I
go.
don't think these reporters asked for that,
Yeah.
and I'm going to start pushing back on every interview I have, and I'm going to be asking these reporters, you need to ask them about this statement. You need to have them show you the scientific data that they said is around the world, because around the world, to me, Canada, Australia, India, all of Europe, they've decided not to use these ingredients, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Which you don't want to find out that the reality is that around the world means they hired some third party group out of India to do this work or something like that because it was more economic for them to do that. I would imagine you find this too quite often when I talk to reporters and investigative journalists. I'm getting them up to speed with things. There's so many things they don't know about. There are really only about 5 or 6 actual credible journalists out there that work in food safety and food policy. Most other times when I'm talking with someone, it's, some junior reporter who was assigned this from their, editorial desk, and they're responding to something. There's also the element where it's not so much for the newspaper or the magazines, it's more for their webpage, because they have to come up with so much web content. And they're reactive in some cases. They're trying to, fit it into, a construct. Oh, we want to do something on food safety. Okay, let me tell you about food safety. Oh, no, I just want to have the 3 foods to avoid. Well, if it was as easy as here's the 3 foods to avoid, then food safety would be a lot different situation in the United States. So there are times where, again, I'm sure you run into this where, I'll spend an hour on the phone with a journalist.
Yeah.
And I'll have maybe a sentence, maybe 2 in the finished article kind of a
Oh,
deal.
yeah. I mean,
Sometimes that even what I say is twisted. That headline, you had that headline up before. Can you bring that up
yeah,
again?
sure. Yeah.
So this reporter, Sadie Whitlock and Emily Joshu, um, would you say that there are some cereals out there because of chemicals that are bad? Yes. Would you say that Fruit Loops is from Kellogg's is one of those because of their colorings? Definitely, that would be on the list. That gets turned into I reveal why Kellogg's Fruit Loops is the worst cereal in the U.S. I never said it was the worst cereal in the U.S. I said it's pretty high up there in the list of concerns in terms of
What is
artificial
the worst
color.
one? Tell us.
I'm not gonna. I don't know, and even if I did
Yeah.
know, I don't know if I would say. I don't know what is the worst cereal.
I think it could be Fruit Loops. I think you were, even if you didn't mean to say this, I think it's probably right.
It
So
could be. It could be. If you, I mean, how do you measure that? Is it the amount of sugar in it? Is it the lack of protein or fiber? There are certain things you measure in terms of how do you measure this. But if you start to look at go beyond the label, okay, and
yeah.
say, all right, well, let's look at how other countries either have requirements. Like, for instance, there cannot be a mascot, there cannot be a cartoon animal, they're not allowed to say this, or they must label it as whether it is or is not part of a healthy diet kind of thing. And yet we don't have those kind of restrictions in the United States. You got to start to wonder why do they have those different policies in other countries about the cereals that come out of the United States. I mean, think about it. Why
Yeah.
would um let's say let's say someone is a history teacher, okay, and you teach US history 5 periods a day. Why would a history teacher say a completely different false set of historical facts to one class and then the real facts to some other classes? Now, one would say, oh my God, there's a problem with that teacher. How dare that teacher not be truthful and accurate and consistent in terms of all their students?
Hmm.
But why don't we say that with cereal? Here's a company in the United States that makes healthier products to sell abroad than they sell here in the United States because they can get away with it. That's one of the concerns I have. The same thing happens with food safety in bigger sense. You have companies that meet the minimum food safety standards. When we're talking about meat and poultry and produce to export across, let's say, into Canada, right?
Hmm.
But they'll use lesser standards in some cases to sell here in the United States. And now one could say, well, technically, the US Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to have complete control over the food. Therefore, that would go to the states. And the states have more control over food. Well, that would be great. I live in California. If all of my food came from California and I believed in everything in terms of California laws and regulations around food safety and additives, and California recently had some changes in terms of regulations with the food dyes that go into foods that go into schools, right? So
Yeah.
that's
11,
great if
actually
all of our
11.
food came within California, but the reality is we
Yeah.
have food that goes all over different states, and all the different states have different rules and regulations.
Yeah, they do, and now it's getting even more hairy because we have I think 10 or 11 now states looking at banning artificial food dyes when really this should be a federal government issue. It should be something that the entire United States follows together, it doesn't make sense for food companies to make a certain product for a certain state or a certain product for just schools. Because what
Right.
happens is these children, they go in, they get hooked on Fruit Loops or Apple Jacks or whatnot. And then they go back home and they see it at the grocery store with their parents. And then they pick up that version. And that's the version that's going to have the dyes and be more attractive even, really. And it's going to cause kind of an issue there. And this is, I mean, this is why I think, fast food, junk food should just not be allowed in schools at all. It should just be all real food. I mean, I hope we get there at one point, but it's about 8:37. So I want to ask you a couple more questions here. Artificial dyes are made from petroleum and coal tar. What do you know about how they're produced and how they can be contaminated with carcinogens?
I know very little about the science behind this. What I do know is that these are highly secured and protected processes and ingredients, and that the the industry does a lot of work to make sure that not only does this information not get out to consumers, but that a picture is painted that oversimplifies and is, quite honestly, in most cases, blatantly false in terms of how healthy these foods are. They
Mhm.
will emphasize one little aspect, like, more fiber than previous recipes. Okay, so you have 1% more fiber, but you also have all these other ingredients that you've added into it, kind of a deal. We've been sold this, and quite honestly, it's more so, bigger than just any one cereal company or cereal brand, if you will. you
Mhm.
know, I grew up on this whole thing of, the right way to start a day is with juice, toast, milk, and your, bowl of this cereal, kind of a thing. And even just, the idea of how much sugar is in the juice, how much, the enriched wheat in the bread, and all these different ingredients, and it became this kind of gold standard. It's one thing to have breakfast. It's another thing to have the shiny color, with the great mascot. When I was growing up, it also had to have the great toy in the cereal box. They're not so great in terms of toys in the cereal boxes these days. But the same thing with cereal boxes. It was literally the same game plan as McDonald's in terms of all the Happy Meals and the cartoon characters and all the gimmicks to basically win over children. So
Yeah.
much more effort is put into that. If they just took a small percentage of that money and effort and investment into what I was talking about in terms of the becoming addictive and the gold standard, and put it into the idea of how can we be healthier and safer, perhaps we wouldn't be having all these conversations.
Yeah. If you had a chance to talk to Kellogg's CEO, what would you tell him?
Uh, you know, your legacy personally and your company's legacy will be measured in terms of what benefit you made to society. And if you say, well, look, I'll be measured by my record profits, blah, 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 that's great. That's great for your stock owners. But if you look at the idea of taking the opportunity to perhaps live up to your commitment when you said you were going to remove artificial dyes, why don't you do that? Why don't you make it such that your food can still be profitable and healthy to not just the healthiest of consumers who may occasionally eat your product, but heaven forbid you make it healthy to the most vulnerable populations, the one who are most likely to become sick, who would eat this every single day. And I know that questions come up. The idea of would you allow your to an executive at a company like this, would you allow your children to eat this every single day? And you never get a very clear answer on this because
Mhm.
most of them realize no, they wouldn't.
And I have one last question, and this is very interesting in that over the last 2 months or so, I've been contacted by several different lawyers that want to take on big food like big tobacco. They're ready to hold them accountable. Do you think that they could get their hands on information through discovery that would show that they're liable in harming children because they know that these dyes cause harm because they had to take out these chemicals in other countries when those regulations hit? Do you think that these cases would be successful?
Ultimately, I think the food industry knows that these cases would not be successful because you would never be able to convince a jury in terms of a direct connection between the actions of a company and the impact on someone's health or livelihood. This is why in the United States, when you look at some 3,000 Americans die every year due to failures in food safety, some 420 um, so 420,000 I'm sorry, 48 million become ill and 128,000 are hospitalized. And yet there's never been an actual court case associated with these. They're all settled out of court because the companies have lawyers. They will protect the brand interest to whatever it costs to do that. And yeah, there have been some court cases, but these have been court cases where they have been like, a violation of interstate commerce or fraud or obstruction of justice, things of that nature. There have never been cases where a food company executive has been held accountable for harming consumers. I don't know if we ever will in my lifetime see such a case,
Mhm.
but it's not just the history of not having those cases. I think it's the fact that the food industry knows that it'll never happen. And so they just continue to do what they do.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of reminds me, though, of a landmark case that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. tried, where he took on Monsanto several times and eventually got a $2.2 billion verdict to show that glyphosate causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Um, that was very interesting to me because I didn't think anything like that could ever occur either. And so with that, and I know I said that was my last question before, but it makes me think of this is now that we have someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that's going to be in possibly in leadership in Washington as the Secretary of HHS. What do you think about that? And what do you think about the prospects of maybe tackling some of the issues that you've seen over your career in a different light? Do you think we have more hope with someone like that is putting more emphasis on these food chemical type issues?
I would like to think that we could find some hope in that, but the reality is when you look at the major changes um, in federal food policy regarding food, and if you look at some of the changes that have been promised here, the amount of industry buy-in and industry support and industry agreement that would have to take place are quite large. You also have to look at the fact that if you look, for instance, at the Food Safety Modernization Act that revolutionized the FDA into being more proactive as opposed to purely reactive, there were starts in terms of getting that going in 2006, 2008. Finally, the same year that the Affordable Health Care Act was passed during President Obama's administration, we
Mhm.
passed the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2010. It was signed by President Obama into law in 2011. It took another 5 years for the rules to be written. And in 2016, the implementation started looking at very large industry all the way down to very small industry, very small companies, larger industries having a smaller timeline than the smaller of industries. You had to have buy-in from all of the states and even smaller than state jurisdictions. We're still dealing with the rollout of this policy. So when you look at the idea of it took 18 years for the most significant policy change in US history to roll out. I have a hard time thinking that even if anyone at the helm of any agency is able to make some significant change, we're not going to see it within any one president's administration. We're going to have to wait perhaps 8, 12, even 16 years to see the true impact of this because our food supply is so complicated. You're also talking about the fact that there's also a lot of international stakeholders within this. So,
Mhm.
the US federal government only has reach that's so far when you're talking about a system that's so global. So there's a lot of challenges to bringing about some of these anticipated changes and addressing some of these concerns, such that hope is a very big word that's underlined, italicized, and has a couple of question marks after it.
Yeah. So I would love to continue the conversation with you, Dr. Detweiler. I think you have been absolutely incredible tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with us and helping us with our Kellogg's campaign to just get more clarity around some of these statements that we've got from them, and clarity on what we should be doing as the Food Babe Army, as the Cancel Kellogg's movement, which I think it's very clear. We continue to boycott, we continue to cancel, we vote with our dollars, we pick other things for cereal, for other cereals like Eat Love Bird and others out there that are doing the right thing. And we look for other, options for breakfast. I mean, I love smoothies. I love oatmeal. I love, eggs and bacon and all the good stuff out there. So, I think what's really, my biggest takeaway from this is that we have a lot of uphill challenges for making changes at the FDA level and the USDA level, but consumers have the biggest power. So I just really appreciate all the work that you do for us. And thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you very much. And just if I could say really quick, I don't want people to become afraid of food. We all have to eat. But if we could do any one thing as consumers, we say things to our children like look both ways before you cross the street, or put on your seatbelt or your car seat, latches or whatever before we go. We know that there is inherent risks and dangers. We even communicate those, but we don't talk about food the same way. I would hope that we could, as parents, talk with our children about food, the idea that we do have responsibility. We don't have 100% of the responsibility, but we do have some percent of the responsibility. And as educated consumers, we can make decisions, much like looking both ways or putting on our seatbelt, that can make us more safer. But we do continue down that road. We do continue to live our lives. We do continue to eat food and find joy and happiness and celebration within the food. It's just that we have to think about food in terms of how can we make it safer, such that, for instance, our upcoming family gatherings around holidays, they're not remembered for how it went all wrong. They're remembered for all the good reasons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Avoid I call it the holiday death aisle. I know that's a little intense, but I call it the holiday death aisle every time you go into a grocery store during a holiday and you see the big display of all the nostalgia and you want to eat all of that junk, but it's full of poison. That's my opinion. But anyways, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Again, these comments have been incredible. I wish I could go back and read all of them. I've been watching some of you guys out there. Thank you, everyone who joined tonight. I'm going to be continuing bringing this series to you of people that I think are really incredible in this world that are speaking out. So, hold on to your hats. There'll be more. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.